Today is day 384. Today's Thursday, October 24th, day 384. Since October 7th of last year, thank you for those who are joining us. Feel free, please, to introduce yourself. Several people joining us from our weekly board check-in. We've been meeting sometimes daily after October 7th a year ago, but the board has been meeting weekly since then. And one of our board members just shared a story of someone they've been walking alongside of in Gaza who was just killed at the beginning of the month. And the reminder that every day loved ones continue to die is a part of the daily reality as we've come together these last 384 days. And so the reason that this news is critically important is not only that we be informed, but that the advocacy and the efforts we're taking to make the violence, the increased militarization stop is critically important. So I will seek to do my best to summarize the news from the past week and try to leave a few minutes for questions of what's been happening in the Middle East. So Thursday, October 24th, day 384. I thought that I would start today by summarizing, where are we at in terms of what's been happening? Where are we at big picture in terms of Israel's war effort? One of the things that happened after October 7th, immediately thereafter, so you had the Hamas attacks, you had, 1,100 plus people killed that day, hostages taken into Gaza. It's not known how many of those hostages remain alive. And then, Israel declared that one of their goals was the eradication of Hamas. And the mechanism by which that was sought to be employed was the cutting off of food, water, gas, and electricity. And in large part, let's be clear, the world has allowed Israel to cut off food, water, gas, and electricity. I mean, the numbers of trucks allowed into Gaza in August and September were at a low for the entire year. So much so that in the last, Monday, a week ago, the U.S. sent a letter to Israel and said, unless humanitarian assistance improves within 30 days, the U.S. will cut weapons. We've heard this only once before. Biden said he might cut weapons prior to the red line of the Rafah offensive. We heard this in May, but the U.S. just said that they would cut weapons if within 30 days Israel would not improve humanitarian assistance into Gaza. Okay, so the mechanism by which Hamas would be brought to submission was using humanitarian assistance as a weapon of war. Now, that has been proven by humanitarian agencies. USAID even acknowledged it, and then Blinken denied it. That's all happened in the last, few months. The other thing that has happened is Israel had this war effort of eradicating Hamas. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that the term often used in the Middle East is like the heads of the snake. These militant groups, they have leaders, and a number of those leaders have been killed in the past several months. So I wanted to take just a few minutes and acknowledge the number of leaders who have been killed. Several of these have been in extrajudicial killings, which according to international law is illegal. These were assassinations that happened in sovereign territory. And I just, want us to think about what that would be like. If a U.S. leader were assassinated, while being in Washington, D.C., that's what this would be like. But I want us to acknowledge who some of these leaders were. They were, responsible for killing a number of people. But this goal of Israel was to eradicate Hamas. So Israel has been, quote unquote, successful militarily in terms of eradicating a number of these leaders. I'll go through them quickly. There's a Guardian article that summarized a number of these. The first, or one of the first, was Saleh al-Arori. He was the deputy chief of Hamas's guiding council. He was one of Hamas's founding members. He was killed in Beirut in an airstrike in January 2024. One of the things that should be acknowledged is a number of these killings also were accompanied by the killing of numbers of civilians, sometimes dozens, sometimes as many as 100. In March of this year, there was an airstrike that killed Marwan Issa. He was a Hamas senior military commander, one of the closed circles who was a part of planning and knowing about the October 7th specific plan of attack. In July, there was a massive Israeli airstrike in al-Mawasi, al-Mawasi was supposed to be a humanitarian zone. That means sacred space. I mean, that means space where people are supposed to be safe. Mohammed Diaf, who was the closest aide to Sinwar, the top military head of Hamas, in July, Mohammed Diaf was killed in this massive Israeli airstrike. Fuad Shakur, a founding member of Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Iran-backed militia in Lebanon, he was killed in an airstrike in July. Shakur had been involved in suicide bombings that were launched against the US, against France, and against Israel in the 80s. He played a key role in increasing Hezbollah's military capabilities. He was a main advisor to Nasrallah. The day after the bombing in Fuad Shakur's being killed, the day after he was killed, Ismail Haniyeh, who was the political leader of Hamas, was killed. This was unheard of. He was killed in a bombing in Tehran, in Iran. His bedroom exploded. He was in a government guest house in Tehran. He had attended the inauguration of the new president, who, by the way, is supposed to be a moderate in Iran. And I think if you've heard my daily updates, you would have heard it was thought maybe Iran did this. The head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard was accused and tortured for having possibly been a part of this. It was thought maybe Iran was actually in cahoots with Israel and the US. Maybe they were a part of this, coming over in support of the West. Maybe they killed Haniyeh to show that they would be in support, that they were legitimately going to, move away from terrorism, quote unquote, et cetera. I mean, there's all kinds of theories about this, right? So Ismail Haniyeh was killed. I mean, this is changing the shape of the Middle East. I want us to understand the significance of what's happened in terms of these individual, deaths. An often understated belief, Haniyeh was a founding member of Hamas. I think that it's really important to acknowledge it's believed Haniyeh had no idea October 7th was going to happen. He did not live in Gaza. He was the political leader of Hamas. Dozens of his family members also have been killed in Israeli airstrikes and shelling. In September, the head of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, was killed in airstrikes in South Beirut. Finally, last week, this was the big news of the week. This was the big lead up. An autopsy report indicated the military leader, the top leader of Hamas, has been killed. Yahya Sinwar, a gunshot to the head is what it's been reported. He'd been hit in the arm in a firefight earlier. He made a tourniquet out of like a phone cord or some type of cord. Hamas confirmed its leader died, but its banner would not fall. Some have argued that this actually made Sinwar a hero. He wasn't killed like a rat in the tunnels. He was a freedom fighter for the Palestinian people. This is what's been reported. He died out in the open. He was the primary one culpable for the October 7th attacks, responsible for thousands of people's deaths, including, many would argue, the subsequent attacks in Gaza. Now, how have people responded? Many Palestinians in Gaza have said, they don't support the October 7th attacks because they perpetrated Israel's response. For over a year, the security establishment in Israel, backed by the United States, has been supportive of, seeking to find Sinwar. So the U.S. supported his killing. And ultimately, they say a unit of trainee squad commanders found Sinwar above ground. There was a drone involved in the attack. U.S. Technology was used, in this operation. Netanyahu responded, many people thought, okay, Sinwar is dead. Finally, we're at a precipice, finally we can have peace. And Netanyahu said, no. He said the war will continue. He said this could be the beginning of the end, but there are no expectations that Netanyahu will bring the war to an end, certainly until after the U.S. elections. Many people believe he's holding out for a Trump win. He has a lot going against him in terms of personal indictments. And so there are not hopes that things will end on the immediate horizon. Netanyahu still has a renewed push for a hostage deal. I'll talk about that in a minute. But essentially, he said the war will continue. Hamas has said that they will continue. Hezbollah has said they will continue as well. Hamas has yet to announce a successor. Hostage families responded both with satisfaction that, to some degree, justice has been done, and also trepidation. What's this mean for the remaining hostages? There was some concern that they would be immediately killed upon his death. Now, the world was paying attention to Sinwar's death, and the U.S. struck 5 underground weapons facilities in Yemen that were Houthi-controlled to seek to, in their words, further degrade Houthis' capabilities for their attacks on the sea. Now, I know people said the past couple of weeks I've been overly cynical about that U.S. letter in terms of humanitarian assistance, and the U.S. saying that the U.S. would withhold weapons. Many of us who've been working on this saw that letter and just said, so what? So what that the U.S. sent this letter? We've heard this before about withholding weapons. Vaccinations were able to be done where 600,000 children received their first vaccinations for polio. And if that can be done, why can't food get into Gaza? Why can't food get into Gaza? Immediately after that letter was sent, in the first days, 50 trucks, then 30 trucks were allowed into North Gaza. North Gaza has been a major hotbed because of the call for displacement, and then it being stated as a hostile zone. So there have been so many deaths there in the past couple of weeks. Just a few days later, Israel stopped processing requests from traders to import food into Gaza for professional companies to be able to import food into Gaza. This was reported by Reuters on October 17th. The significance of this, these trading companies provided over the past year more than 40% of the aid that has gone into Gaza. Since October 11th, Gaza-based traders were importing food from Israel and the occupied West Bank. They've been one of the major suppliers. And just a few days after this demand that more humanitarian assistance be allowed into Gaza, Israel stopped processing all requests from these traders to import food into Gaza. I want to sit and just be still to let you listen to the absurdity of what's being reported in the news and what's actually happening. So the U.S. says let in more humanitarian assistance, and Israel stops processing requests from traders. Okay, I'm going to keep moving. I'm sorry. Okay. Then on Sunday morning this last week, the IDF struck 175 military targets in Gaza and Lebanon. 73 people were killed in an airstrike that struck homes in North Gaza. This was in Beit Lahia. The number of deaths this weekend was one of the highest death tolls in months. The U.S. on Monday, this is the same time we're saying, oh, we'll withhold weapons if you don't send humanitarian assistance. The same time, it's announced that that THAAD missile system that the U.S. sent, which, by the way, is accompanied by U.S. troops, which, by the way, could be a violation of the War Powers Act because we're sending troops into an active war zone. It's announced that it was ready to go. It's set up and ready to use. So evacuation orders are in Gaza. People are trying to leave. The people are being killed. the US and European countries had a meeting with Israel. Israel tries to say, by the way, we've not applied this general's plan. The general's plan is a plan that is written and codified. You can find it online in Hebrew that says there's a plan to intentionally starve out people in North Gaza. It says specifically Hamas as a strategy of using starvation as a weapon of war. And Western diplomats told Haaretz that they were not satisfied that Israel did enough to quiet their fears and get reliable enough information, that the entire population of North Gaza would be removed, as a part of their strategy. All of that happened in this last week. Israel is continuing to prevent humanitarian aid from reaching North Gaza. It was reported, including food and medicine. UNRWA reported that this last week. And the death toll is now at least 42,718 people killed in Gaza, with those wounded being several hundred, over 100,000 people. The Israeli army said tens of thousands of Palestinians have evacuated from the Jabalia refugee camp in North Gaza. At least 150 Hamas members have been detained. The polio vaccination campaign had to be put on hold. More than 100,000 children in Gaza will not receive their second vaccinations for polio because the situation in North Gaza is so bad because of bombing, because of the lack of safety, because humanitarian actors cannot get in to deliver these vaccinations because of the situation there. 35 Palestinians were killed in the Strip just since Wednesday morning, 31 of those in North Gaza. Israeli strikes in Gaza killed 16 people yesterday alone. There was a report this last week. It could take up to 350 years, AP News reported, for Gaza's battered economy to return to its pre-war level, according to the UN Conference on Trade and Development. In the West Bank, there were escalations this last week. Settlers set houses on fire in a West Bank village, according to security sources. There was also an 11-year-old that was killed in the West Bank this last week. Then that's not even talking about Lebanon. There have been escalations between UNIFIL, the peacekeeping force, where they've been fired at multiple times. Israel told them to evacuate. They said no. There were 3 Israeli soldiers injured in a friendly fire incident. Rockets have been going back and forth between Hezbollah and Israel. Israel killed Hezbollah commanders. There have been soldiers killed both in Lebanon and in Gaza. Secretary Austin said the number of civilian casualties in Lebanon was far too high. He said he'd like to see Israel scale back on some of its strikes that it's taking, especially in and around Beirut. Hochstein, the U.S. envoy, who I read, and I want to verify this, actually served in the Israeli Defense Forces. I want to verify that. But he's our U.S. envoy, had talks with Lebanese officials in Beirut on conditions for an Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire. 13 people were killed on Tuesday and 57 injured. This was reported on Tuesday about Monday's numbers in Lebanon. Israeli troops killed 3 Lebanese soldiers on Sunday. There was a visit in Beirut by Hochstein saying that the Israel-Hezbollah conflict would only be resolved by applying the UN Security Council Resolution 1701. 1701 was the resolution that was passed after the 2006 war between Hezbollah and Israel. It's the resolution that says Hezbollah should be disarmed and Israel should return and remove itself from the northern border. 63 people were killed in Lebanon on Monday. More than 230 people were injured. The death toll in Lebanon as of Monday, since October 7th, was more than 2,500 people killed and close to 12,000 people wounded. So that's my little symbol that it's about time to wrap it up. Meanwhile, there was a leak of top secret documents that the US is investigating. They were published by an Iran-affiliated Telegram account. We're still waiting on a potential attack that Israel would respond to the Iranian attack. All of this was retaliation. Israel and Iran have been going back and forth. Iran would say Israel began because Israel attacked its sovereign territory when it attacked an embassy in Syria months ago. 7 people were arrested in East Jerusalem on suspicion of planning attacks for Iran. There have been concerns about the U.S.-Jordanian border. I don't know if you heard 2 armed men who were dressed in military fatigues this last week entered Israel from Jordan and opened fire at Israeli soldiers on the South Dead Sea. They wounded 2 people before they were shot and killed by Israeli forces. There was also an event that was called Preparing for Settlement of Gaza that was held near the Gaza border, and several ministers, including Ben-Gvir and others, attended. In the U.S., Pentagon officials were concerned about the flow of U.S. weapons. If the U.S. keeps arming the Ukraine and Israel to this degree, Army officials said that it will not be able to respond if there are any additional conflicts. The State Department's also probing potential human rights violations by an IDF unit in charge of guarding detainees from Gaza. This is about that state Taman facility and the unit Force 100. I did an extensive update about the Leahy laws in one of my updates earlier this week. I won't go into that right now. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been in Israel this past week and met with Netanyahu and other officials yesterday. I do want to just take a minute and say there is a new proposal. The U.S. is now talking about a very minimal proposal that could be incremental regarding a hostage deal, which would allow for a limited deal where a few hostages, less than 10 hostages, would be released. There could even be a few days of a temporary ceasefire. This would be an indication of whether or not Hamas is serious to reach a broader agreement. So that's what's currently being discussed. Bernie Sanders and 11 other Democrats yesterday urged the Justice Department to open a formal investigation into an airstrike that was in South Lebanon a year ago, where several journalists, including an American journalist, was injured. 1 journalist was killed. And I have been talking about that in my daily updates as well. Issam Abdallah was the journalist who was killed by Israeli shell fire. You know, this is another incident like that of Shireen Abu Akleh, who was the American journalist who was killed, where journalists are clearly marked as media. And, 1 journalist lost their leg, several other journalists were injured, and another was killed. This was in October of 2023. I mentioned the 11-year-old boy in the West Bank who was killed by the IDF on Tuesday of this week. He had been throwing stones at a military vehicle. I wanted to close with an update from Ali Hospital. Embrace the Middle East provided this update. The hospital is in North Gaza. They have been serving over 1,000 people coming through their doors every day. You know, their capacity before the war was less than a couple hundred. They have been treating 150 patients. They are out of the materials that they need. They have had to postpone treatment for cases because they just have had to do triage. They said famine is a very serious risk. There's an update from Dr. Maher, who's the medical director. He lost his home. He had to evacuate. They've lost everything, and yet he's still continuing to serve at the hospital. He said, believing that wars only bring disaster, loss, and prolonged suffering, this current war in Gaza has reinforced my belief that the consequences of war are not only painful, but catastrophic. I pray to our Lord to grant wisdom for the leaders to work for an immediate ceasefire, provide emergency relief, and work towards just and lasting peace that will bring a prosperous future for all. I would point people as well. CMEP joined with an international coalition and put out a statement on October 15th. That's a summary of what's happening in northern Gaza. That statement's called Northern Gaza Being Erased. Global Leaders Must Act Now. And we'd encourage you, use those statements in your advocacy and in your engagement. Those are a great thing to send to your elected officials, or use them for talking points. And it's a great opportunity to use them to write op-eds. And so write op-eds to your local newspapers. That's a great way to also spread the word. You can use them for prayer points as well. So thank you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your continued efforts. We will not give up hope, and we'll continue to seek to be diligent, continue in our prayers, and continue in our advocacy. So may God go before us, and many blessings to you. Amen.